Joseph Ford is a fascinating figure. So Joseph Ford is a black man who starts working at the Capitol in 1881, and he will continue to serve during most sessions into the mid-1930s. So he has a remarkable tenure. His origin story is, it's American. I don't know if there's another way to say this. Joseph Ford was born enslaved in Virginia in the 1850s. We don't know much about his early years. We know, according to his own storytelling, that he was born on a plantation in Virginia and that he served as a valet to his master when his master was in the Confederate Army. So he was involved in the Civil War as a young man. Probably not on the side he wanted to be involved with, though. He probably gains his freedom at the end of the war. I have not seen anything that leads me to believe he was able to escape before that or leave after the Emancipation Proclamation. He ends up in Michigan in the 1870s, early 1870s, and he will end up in Grand Rapids. And he will work for the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad for decades as a porter. These were jobs that were open to black men, and they carried some prestige. It is inherently a service position, and in this capacity, Joe becomes very well known to people who are riding the trains. And some of the people who are riding the trains are elected officials who take the trains from Grand Rapids to Lansing for session. Somehow, Joe starts to make political connections. He will be involved in party politics throughout much of his adult life. He was a Republican, as most African Americans were at that time. And I will pause here for a quick note. Joe is often referred to in articles as an Afro-American. That was the term of choice in the late 19th century. He marries in 1881, and that same year, he is appointed as the keeper of the Cloak Room for the Senate. Now, what does that mean? Well, the Senate chamber occupies one large wing of the Capitol building. So if you're familiar with the building, this is the south wing. The Cloak Room would have been just behind the chamber on the second floor. In fact, it is still called the Cloak Room to this day. The Cloak Room was a place where senators could leave their cloaks, could leave hats. It is a place where they could step off the floor and get a drink, have a bite to eat. It is connected or immediately adjacent to the washrooms that were used by members during session. It is one of a number of rooms that wrap around the chamber that basically provide support for those working in the chamber, which is going to include senators. It's going to include the Secretary of the Senate and his staff who are keeping all of the records. It's also going to include newspaper reporters who attend session on the floor up in the corners. And it's going to include the President of the Senate, the Lieutenant Governor. Now, typically, these appointments are made by leadership, always on the majority side. So we see Joe working consistently during Republican sessions. He does not get reappointed when the Democrats are in control. And he is going to be working in a service position, but it is still going to be seen as a very respectable position. This is something that would have been seen as a political plum, because in this era, all of these jobs are based on political appointment. The concept of nonpartisanship of civil service doesn't really exist yet in government. Clearly, though, he was good at his job because he was reappointed over and over and over again for over 50 years. His overall responsibility would be to make sure that the senators were taken care of. That could mean making sure that they were stocked with coffee in the morning, that there was lunch when they got hungry. It is possible he could have arranged for someone to come in and provide shoe shines. It is possible he could have kept a few illicit beverages in a back cupboard for when everyone decided it was time for an afternoon drink or an evening nightcap. He would have been responsible for keeping that area clean, although there were other janitors that he worked with who would have helped in that. He also may have been helping senators obtain the papers that they needed, store books. He was basically there to serve in some ways as the first line of help for whatever any senator decided he needed. So we do know in some instances where he stayed. You can track these things through various sources. Like most people who came to Lansing for session, including legislators, he would have stayed at a boarding house or a hotel. In his case, I believe it was a boarding house. That is very common. And what is interesting is early on, we see African Americans and white Capitol employees staying at the same places. There is not a firm line of segregation in the 1880s in Lansing. That will change in the 20th century. You also have to think about the fact that he has a foot in both worlds. He likely goes home on the weekends. Most people did. Session was 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. So Friday night, he could have got a train out, or Saturday morning. So he could have gone back home to be with his family on the weekend. But as someone who is here for session, which starts in January and could be done in April, could be done in June, could be done in July, and this is every other year primarily, he also certainly would have made a lot of connections in the Lansing community. And I would not be surprised if he came to have friends in the Black community in Lansing, because Lansing did have a small but very active Black community at that time. There was an AME church here. He was a member of an AME church back home. It is possible he could have gone to Wednesday night services if they happened at that time, and if he wanted to, and if he could get out of work to attend to them. This is often true of Capitol figures who don't move to Lansing. They have one foot in the Lansing world, and they have one foot back home, wherever home is.